Now, Julie, if this were an in-person class, I'd definitely ask for a show of hands, who has heard of the repository design pattern? I would expect most hands to go up.
I hope so too. I think the repository pattern is by far the most popular element of DDD to be practiced outside of domain-driven design. They can be valuable in so many applications as a way to simplify data access and enforce separation of concerns. When I began learning about repositories and implementing them in my own software design, it had a huge impact on my application architecture. Along with automated testing practices, it really forced me to consider separation of concerns with each method and behavior I added to my software. It really made me stop and think, okay, where does this really belong?
Yeah, personally, I love the pattern, and I find it makes it much easier for me to write good, testable code. We're going to talk about using repositories within a DDD application, but if you want to learn more about the pattern itself, you can look in the Design Patterns library. And I know Julie also discusses using them with Entity Framework in her Entity Framework in the Enterprise course.
Any system that needs to persist between restarts has some kind of persistent storage for the state of the system, like a database. Many applications focus a great deal of effort on the mechanics of querying, fetching, and translating data to and from objects, to the point where it distracts from the model that these objects are meant to represent. And having ad hoc access to the data source also promotes having developers query for any bit of data they want, anytime they want, rather than using aggregates. This makes it pretty difficult to manage the consistency of aggregates by enforcing their invariance. At best, the logic for enforcing the integrity of the model becomes scattered among many queries, and at worst, it's not done at all.
Applying model-first design and separation of concerns means pushing persistence behavior into its own set of abstractions, which we refer to as repositories. Only certain objects, like specifically aggregate roots, should be available via global requests. Repositories provide this access, and through omission, prevent access to non-aggregate objects, except through their aggregate roots. They give you the ability to constrain the data access so you avoid lots of random data access code throughout your application.
When you think about the life cycle of an object in your application, you should consider two cases. In the first case, you have objects that are not persisted. These objects are created, perform some work, and then they're destroyed. In the second case, you have objects that are persisted. These objects have a slightly more involved life cycle, since after the object is created, it must be reconstituted with whatever state it had when it was last saved. Then it can perform whatever work the application needs it to do, after which it may need to save its state to some persistent storage before finally being destroyed. You can use repositories to manage the life cycle of your persistent objects without the objects having to know anything about their persistence. We call these objects persistence ignorant.
In his book Domain-Driven Design, Eric Evans speaks quite a bit about repositories. They can be summed up by saying that a repository represents all objects of a certain type as a conceptual set, like a collection with more elaborate querying capability.